literature in English is immensely popular among Bangladeshi readership. A handful of Indian authors who write in English have become a significant part of our curriculums of different universities for the students of honors and master's levels. I like to mention some of the names of some Indian writers, popular Indian writers who write in English. Amitav Ghosh, Mulk Raj Anand, R.K. Narayan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Arundhati Roy, Bikram Sheth, Salman Rushdie, Arvind Adiga, and many others. These brilliant writers have become a very important part of our readership today in Bangladesh. And many writers who write in Bangla, the writers from West Bengal, are also immensely popular among us. For example, Shamaresh Mujumdar, Shirshendu Mukhopadhyay, Abul Bashar, Mohasheta Devi, Shankho Ghosh, and many others. They have become an important part of our readership. Now, I like to say at the very inception of my discussion on Amitav Ghosh's Shadowline, I just like to say why Amitav Ghosh has become relevant in our country. Amitav Ghosh is very relevant in Bangladesh because of the wide range of his subject matters that has encompassed cultural crisis, the issues of climate change and its impact on culture. In this connection, I like to mention one of his seminal books. It's a non-fiction. The name of the book is The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. In this book, Ghosh says that climate change impacts the cultural change. That is, cultural change is closely related to climate change because it causes migration of the people. It also causes diaspora. For that reason, the study of climate change has become a very important part of Amitav Ghosh's writing. And then another important subject matter that invites the Bangladeshi readers to have a deep reading of Amitav Ghosh's writing. That is, he invites the readers to reread and rethink our historiography. Just like an archaeologist, as we find in Michel Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge, Amitav Ghosh digs deeper into our history and historical events like our colonial experiences, post-colonial response to our history, then Bengal partition of 1905, then Indian partition of 1947, communal riot of 1963-64 in Calcutta and Dhaka, the rise of capitalism. So all these important issues have become inevitable parts of the literary works of Amitav Ghosh. And these issues are also very, very relevant to the Bangladeshi readers and, in broad sense, the readers of the whole world. His study of the realities of the subaltern that we find in his Hungry Tide is also an attraction, is also an important area of thinking for the Bangladeshi readers. And in Hungry Tide, that is one of his seminal novels, we find that he has described the realities of the life of the subaltern living in the adjacent areas of the Sundarbans. So that very study has become a very immensely popular study for the Bangladeshi leadership. Moreover, his works concentrate on the regions adjacent to the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean. So his narratology offers multifaceted and multi-layered works that can be studied from various perspectives. It can be studied from historical perspective, cultural perspective, ecological perspective. We can analyze his texts eco-critically, and we can also approach his texts from a structuralist point of view. So I have just mentioned these perspectives to show how multifarious or multifaceted writer Amitav Ghosh is. He really deserves our special attention. Now I like to concentrate on his text, The Shadow Lines. Like his other novels, this fiction produces a narrative which is closely related to the historical realities of the people living in this subcontinent. Actually, Amitav Ghosh is a master storyteller, and his stories make his readers acquainted with the realities that shape their identity, their nationality, their cultural identity. Actually, in an interview, Ghosh has said, a novel should reflect the reality in which it is written. The task of a novelist is not to produce propaganda. So this very assertion or this very proclamation proves that Amitav Ghosh is a very conscious writer, a very historically conscious writer, culturally conscious writer, politically conscious writer. We cannot study Amitav Ghosh alienating him from the issues all around us. In this connection, if I look into The Shadow Lines, I find that here Ghosh has offered a historiography that challenged the colonial historiography of our subcontinent. Actually, we can analyze this text, or we can treat this text as a counter discourse. The discourse that our colonial rulers produced, the discourse with which they misguided us, the discourse with which they sowed the seed of hostility among us, that very discourse is anatomized by Amitav Ghosh. And to do this job, while doing this job, he has referred to, and he has also critically analyzed the historical realities related to the people of this subcontinent. Actually, the historiography produced by James Mill, Max Muller, and Macaulay sowed the seed of bitter communal violence. Two-nation theory, Bengal partition of 1905, then Indian partition of 1947, and the successive riots in both the parts across the whimsical border. I call this border whimsical because this border was demarcated by a man, Cyril Radcliffe, who had never visited India before 1947. And he did not have the idea of the communal harmony among the people here. He did not know how district is constructed in our country, how Thana is formed in our area. He did not have the slightest ideas of all these things. But he was appointed to demarcate the borders on the basis of the religious demography. And he did this job. He completed this job only in, it is said that only in 7 weeks. Sitting in a room, he whimsically demarcated the borders, and he made millions of people refugees overnight. Millions of people became rootless overnight. And all these things, all these arbitrary activities of the colonizers sowed the permanent seed of communal violence, which still very often challenges our cultural identity. I think this very historical reality has been incorporated in the shadow lines of Amitav Ghosh. It's a story of 2 families. I just like to throw some light on the story of this text in brief. So we find 2 families here. Thamma's family or Thakurma's family living in Calcutta, and her sister Maya Devi, who was the wife of Mr. Datta Chaudhary, Justice Datta Chaudhary, and at one phase of their life they went to London, and there they developed intimacy with an English family, that is Price family. And Thamma's Jethamashai lives in Dhaka, the then East Bengal or East Pakistan. The story of the novel develops in a non-linear fashion through an excellent narratology emanating from a narrator who is a minor boy. His name is not mentioned in this text. He has learned to imagine a broader world from his uncle Tridi, who is killed in a riot in Dhaka in 1964. So after the killing of Tridi, the reaction that Thamma exhibits can invite the readers to explore the historical realities that have challenged the identity of Thamma. If we analyze Thamma's character from new historicist perspective or from the contextual perspective, then it is found that she was born in Dhaka in 1902. That is, she was born in Dhaka, and at that time it was East Bengal. Afterwards, she settled in Calcutta, and she was desperately trying to liberate the country. That is, she even decided to join the terrorist groups to fight against the British colonizers. So she was desperate for liberty. But after liberty in 1947, she still, to her dismay, finds that communal violence is corrosively challenging our identity. She attempts to bring things together. So she went to Dhaka in 1964, along with Tridi, that is her sister's son, then May Price, beloved of Tridib, Maya Devi, Tridib's mother, to bring her Jethamashai back to Calcutta. But in the surge of communal riot, Tridib and 90 years old Jethamashai were killed. And another person, actually Amitav Ghosh has very tactfully chosen this character from subaltern group, that is Khalil, a rickshaw puller, who looks after Jethamashai in his old age. This rickshaw puller was also killed in the riot. So now, what was the reaction of Thamma after this tragic incident? Thamma, out of fury, decides to sell her beloved gold chain and donate the money to fight against the Muslims. I think Thamma's character deserves intensive exploration to understand the mind of the people living in this area or in these areas. And it will also help us understand psychology, then identity, the conception of nation state, culture. So these important issues deserve attention, while we will concentrate on the analysis of the character of Thamma. And all these things that we find in this text, all these issues that are presented in these texts, are not accidental issues, or are not, these incidents did not take place overnight. Actually, as I have already mentioned, that archaeology of knowledge. So if we dig deeper into the history, if we dig deeper into these realities, then we will go back to our historiography. And in this connection, I like to mention Homike Bhabha's famous book, Location of Culture. In that very book, Bhabha has said, colonialism affects the culture and identity of the natives. And colonialism also makes the natives sway between belonging and citizenship. To lend weight to this view, let us look back to our history. Before the advent of colonialism, religious faiths or religious doctrines did not work as a political drive, or did not work in very extremely in political activities in India. The Hindus and Muslims worked side by side. Accommodation of differences is a typical characteristic of India. So India is great because India accommodates differences. India is proud of its greatness. Its greatness lies in its accommodative tendency or attitude. India accommodates differences. And Swami Vivekananda has declared in the World Parliament's Religion in Chicago that acceptance of difference was central to the Indian experience throughout its long civilizational history. So mutual cooperation, brotherhood, amity, affinity, these are the characteristics of Indian people. Indian people are not originally hostile to one another. The affinity between the Hindus and Muslims constructed a syncretic culture in India. Muslim poets, musicians, and singers wrote or sang Hindu devotional songs. And we may refer to Kazi Nazrul Islam, who has written also Shama Sangit. And Hindus also visited, or they also thronged Sufi shrines of Muslims. So soldiers, suppose Muslim soldiers under the Maratha leader Shivaji, and many Hindu soldiers worked even under the extremely Islamist ruler Aurangzeb. So there are hundreds of examples of Hindu-Muslim amity, Hindu-Muslim affinity in India. But large-scale conflicts between Hindus and Muslims began only under colonial rule. And Shashi Tharoor, in his book, An Era of Darkness, he has mentioned it also, that large-scale conflicts between Hindus and Muslims began only under colonial rule. Now, how and why? The answer is not hard to seek. Even in 1857, the Hindu and Muslim soldiers rebelled against British Raj unitedly. The Hindus and Muslims, Hindu soldiers and Muslim soldiers revolted against British Raj unitedly. And that was a cause of headache for the British rulers. In 1857, Lord Elphinstone, the British governor of Bombay, told London that they would practice divide and rule policy in India. They would practice divide and rule policy in India. Actually, divide and rule policy was at first introduced by King Philip, that is Alexander the Great's father. And the British borrowed that very maxim and they applied here in India. A few decades later, of 1857 rebellion, that was a rebellion, and that was the first revolt for our independence in this subcontinent. But the British historiography has marked it, labeled it as a mutiny, that is sepoy mutiny. Actually, branding, naming, labeling, it's a colonial politics to suppress or exercise hegemony upon the natives of a locality. So we were also the victim of that deliberate politics of British colonizers. They branded that very significant episode of our history as a mere sepoy mutiny. Actually, that was the first revolt for independence. Anyway, a few decades later, Sir John Strachey said the existence of hostile creeds among the Indian people would fortify the political position of the British Raj in India. Now, this hostility among the creeds was also a construction of deliberate project of Warren Hastings, who was the first de facto Governor General of India. Warren Hastings. In 1774, he took the charge of this position. He hired then 11 Pandits and asked them to develop the ordinations of the Pandits. Actually, his purpose was to divide the Hindus deliberately by using their old traditional texts and scriptures. Hastings was successful in introducing hierarchy in Hindu society and set them against one another. So Hastings very deliberately brought all these things together, and he put one section of people against another section of people, people of one religion against people of another religion. So that was a deliberate project of colonial enterprise. The colonial policy kept the Muslims out of the narratives of India. colonial historiography divided Indian history into Hindu rule, Muslim rule, and British rule, thus deliberately put these two major groups of people against each other. That is, Hindus against Muslims, Muslims against Hindus. Actually, this colonial historiography sowed the seed of two nations theory also. So two nations theory was not an accidental invention of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Actually, it emanated from history. And if we, just like archaeologists, explore or dig deeper into our history, then we find how this two-nation theory came to Jinnah through different incidents, realities. So two-nation theory was evolutionized, and it had got a long history. And finally, and we know that even in 1905, the Bengal was divided by Lord Curzon. Actually, he had a lame subterfuge. His subterfuge was that it was done for administrative purpose, so that they can run the administration easily. But actually, their purpose was to divide the Bengalis who were very much conscious of their rights, who responded to the British colonial exploitation, who at different phases of history became united and raised their voice against colonial oppression. Actually, it was the British purpose, it was their purpose to weaken that very voice, that very stamina. So they deliberately divided Bengal in 1905. And Lord Curzon did it. And finally, in 1947, India was divided on the basis of religious demography, which is still a fatal blow on the cultural unity. The seed of bitterness, which was sowed in 1947, germinated successively in the form of a poisonous tree of communal violence or riots. One of such corrosive riots has been depicted as a major incident in the Shadow Lines. The ethnic cleansing violence started in Dhaka and Calcutta, and at that time, the sacred hair of Prophet Muhammad was stolen from Hazrat Bal shrine of Srinagar, and on the basis of this particular incident, there was a violent riot in Dhaka and in Calcutta. And at that time, we know that Ayub Khan, who was the president of Pakistan of that time, instigated that very violence. He came to Dhaka, and while he was leaving for Islamabad in Dhaka airport, he declared that he would not to be blamed for the reaction of, to that incident. That is, whatever the people of East Pakistan would do, for those, he would not to be blamed. So actually, he speaks like inheritor of colonial legacy. Actually, he infuriated the people. And at that time, many unwanted things happened here. Muslims grabbed the land, the houses of Hindus. They looted, plundered the business or shops or business institutions or organizations of Hindus. Even the politicians who at that time held important positions in the government also they also got involved in this looting and plundering of the property of uh, Hindus. I like to mention a name, Abdul Sabur Khan, who was the communication minister of Pakistan at that time in 1964. He also grabbed 3 bighas of land of a Hindu merchant living in Khulna. His name was Rupchand Biswas. So he grabbed 3 bighas of land of that very Hindu merchant. Not only that, he also built a 2-storied building on that land. And then Rupchand Biswas went to the court and he won the prosecution. And the court ordered Abdul Sabur Khan to pay compensation of the amount of 1,35,000 rupees. So, in such a very crucial situation, or in such a very predicament, our nobles, one of the protagonists, that is Thamma, came to Dhaka to take her Jatamashai back to Calcutta. But tragically, Tridib, that is her sister's son, and Jetamoshai of Thamma, who was a man of above 90 years, and a rickshaw puller named Khalil, who looks after Jetamoshai, were killed in the riot. I like to say that Amitav Ghosh has invited his readers to reread and rethink about his historiography. And through investigation of our historiography, will reveal the factors responsible for communal violence and our identity crisis, cultural crisis. The rereading of the colonial historiography also reveals that we find in Ranajit Guha's famous book, Dominance Without Hegemony. In that very book, Ranajit Guha has said that the British colonizers did never want to construct nation state in India. That they did in Europe. Actually, their form of dominance, their form of ruling in this subcontinent was different from their government system in Europe. They did never want that India should develop as a nation state, or India should develop a well-organized government system. They did never want it. They did never want that the people living in this subcontinent should be made citizens. Their project was to transform the people of India into subjects, not citizens, but subjects. And they did it with a deliberate purpose of dividing the people on the basis of their religious ideologies, on the basis of their castes and creeds. And behind that very project, they had the only purpose of accumulating capital. We know it. And they did it very successfully. They retarded our nationalism and instigated xenophobia and disintegration among the natives, from which we are still suffering. This colonial project has put shadow lines in the form of arbitrary cartographic demarcations, communal or ideological differences, mutual hatred and violence. It dislocates millions of people like Thamma, who has no home. If we critically analyze Thamma's character, She seems to be an entity swaying between the sense of belonging and nationality. She was born in Dhaka, and in her old age, she comes back to Dhaka and she gathers a very bitter experience. She falls victim to communal riot, and then she again goes back to Calcutta and she cherishes hatred for the Muslims. So this divided self, the self which is divided between sense of belonging and nationality, actually all these things are the creation of colonial historiography. So these shadow lines have created socio-cultural differences across nations. A space is created between nations that discover, like the narrator of this novel. The narrator of this novel says at one point, I like to quote him. He says, the narrator says, I believed in the reality of space. I believed that distance separates, that it is corporeal substance. I believed in the reality of nations and borders. I believed across the borders there existed another reality. The only relationship my vocabulary permitted between those separate realities was war or friendship. So I like to conclude with my emphasis on the word friendship, which in association with the openness or broadness of our minds can help us overcome shadow lines and live in close to each other with all differences. We have our differences. We have differences of our ideologies. We have differences of our geographical location. But still we are brothers. But still we are one. We are one in our spirit. We are one. We can achieve this oneness with the broadness of our mind, with the openness of our mind. I think this is the message that Amitav Ghosh has put in this very text. So I like to stop here